I don't think any facility is 100% doing electronic tracking of their loaners. I think for the most part, there's some manual paperwork involved, whether it's the rep bringing a handwritten out script attached to the loaners or the little cards that get attached to the thing when they go through the wash or whatever. So I estimated, I would say at least 90% of the facilities, they're doing at least some sort of manual tracking of these trays.
Rising above the ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for people, processes and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we're speaking with Jill Sweeney, Clinical Educator at Censis, and we're going to take this tracking conversation all the way to vendor-managed inventory, Hank, and it's going to be all about loaners, consignments, vendor reps, and all the ways that technology can help you manage that and maybe keep a little heat off your back and also get some documentation around making sure that policies and procedures around getting those IFUs in time is going to be followed.
I'm kind of proud of the title of this one, Justin, Savings and Loaners. I mean, how awesome is that? We were talking about all the ways you can save your butt, you can save your patient, you can save the Benjamins, all kinds of savings around loaner tracking. So yeah, let's get Jill in the studio here and get this conversational party started.
All right, we're going to be right back. Jill Sweeney up next from Censis Technologies. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Hank Walsh.
From the 17 studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Jill Sweeney, Clinical Educator at Censis. And Jill, we're very excited to have you for your first appearance here on the Beyond Clean podcast. And we're going to be talking about loaners in the context of this season and tracking systems. And obviously, you work for a company that has a tracking system. So nobody better than to tell us about how we can really tackle this one, which I think not only for sterile processing people out there, but even supply chain is very concerned about loaners and consignment trays and tracking this. So thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Why don't you talk a little bit about your background? Tell everybody, what got you passionate about sterile processing and in particular, how you wound up with Censis.
Sure. I had a previous career, my previous life. I think I was 44, decided to go back to school, went back to school to be a surgical tech, kind of stumbled into sterile processing along the way. I did scrub for a little while, however, decided I didn't so much I preferred not to be in the OR, and I really decided I really enjoyed being in SPD. So I started out just as regular staff, worked at a couple different hospitals in SPD, and then I moved into a travel role, worked as a traveler. I did that until COVID hit, all the contracts disappeared, and then I needed quickly to find something. And so I had taken another permanent staff position. However, shortly thereafter, I stumbled upon Censis, and by far the best company I've ever worked for.
Excellent. That's a unique path, too, because one thing I've seen with the pandemic is it seems like travelers, maybe in the early going, had a hard time finding work, but nowadays it seems like it's everywhere. So, but who knows if that will stay stable. And what is it that you do? I know you're a clinical educator at Censis, but, what are kind of like the types of things you're doing on a day-to-day basis?
Generally, I fly out every Monday, fly home on Friday, and I'm flying to different hospitals around the United States. I'm either doing training with the different hospital staff, OR and SPD staff, or I'm conducting clinical assessments. This month, for example, I'm doing assessments. So then I go on site, assess their CensiTrac usage, and then make recommendations on how they can better utilize CensiTrac to, track all their instrumentation, their procedures, and things like that.
So when it comes to, as we refine kind of our conversation for today, because we've had lots of conversations from different angles already this season with many more episodes we're about the midway point in this season. When we talk about tracking loaners, what is the information that's needed for that to do a good job? What are we talking about? What kinds of trays? And then maybe a second part of that I'll get to after that.
I guess loaners can kind of be, it's kind of a broad category. Some facilities consider loaners only things that come in one day, they're used for a procedure, and then they leave, shortly thereafter the procedure. Other places will include consignment, which, trays that don't belong to the hospital, but they live at the hospital, and maybe they'll treat those as loaners, even though technically they're their own trays in terms of our tracking system. Between those two things, generally there's a vendor rep involved to, kind of coordinate the process of those trays coming in and the trays making their way through that perioperative loop. And then, if they're true loaners, leaving from the facility at the end of the process.
And then what kind of information or data points are we collecting when we talk about tracking, sort of like, a good example is orthopedic and spine, but neuro, it's not limited necessarily, but what kinds of data points are we trying to get? How are we getting them? Who's giving it to us? What are some of the logistics around that?
Well, generally, surgery gets scheduled. So that surgery scheduler, whoever, if it's a person or a software or whatever at the hospital, they'll be the ones that identify what trays are needed. They'll be in contact with the rep to let the rep know, what trays are needed, when the case is, when they need to bring them in. The rep then would bring them in. The SPD staff would receive those trays, process the trays, send them through the process, sterilize them, get them ready, and then they're going to get, scanned to either like a holding location until the case, or depending on when the case is, scanned into a case cart, and then sent up to the OR for the procedure. After the procedure, then they're going to get scanned, or they should get scanned back down, or the tracking should take them back down to decontam, back through the washers. And then if they're true loaners, they're going to be leaving the facility. They should be scanned to, be scanned out of the facility so that the rep knows they're ready to go, and, they can be out of the system at that point.
So, Jill, we're going to talk a little bit about all of the places in that cycle that data loop can break, I guess, here in a moment. But before I get into that, because I'm all about those holes, because we know there's a design and then there's the reality, and the reality is challenging at times, which is why roles like yours are so important. But I'm kind of curious if you've got a guesstimate, or if anybody that you know out there that you've kind of had experience with in the tracking space, if we were to say, what percentage of departments out there today are currently doing some form of manual tracking of loaners? What would you say? Are we kind of in the 50-50 zone today? Are we more like, 70% are doing manual and just like 30 are doing electronic? Like, what's your gauge on the market, I guess?
In the facilities I've been in, either as a traveler or working with Censis, I don't think any facility is 100% doing electronic tracking of their loaners. I think for the most part, there's some manual paperwork involved, whether it's the rep bringing a handwritten out script attached to the loaners, or the little cards that get attached to the thing when they go through the wash or whatever. So I estimated, I would say at least 90% of the facilities, they're doing at least some sort of manual tracking of those trays.
So that's what I was thinking you were going to say, which leads me to my next question. Why is it so difficult, particularly for that loaner category, including the consignment trays, as you mentioned? Why are they often the last of the Mohicans of the instruments that start being tracked? So like, you got a tracking system, everything else kind of gets built in there, and then we've got these little like stepchildren. No offense, because I'm a stepchild, but we got these stepchildren out there that are just kind of quasi halfway kind of being tracked, and yet they're just as critical to the perioperative process actually going off without a hitch. Like, why do they get second fiddle?
I think you kind of brushed on it earlier. I think there's a lot of links in that chain and a lot of places where that can break down. So I think a lot of people want to hold on to that paper because they want to make sure that they have as much documentation related to those loaners as possible. So I think that maybe some places could go to just strictly electronic documentation. However, they're reluctant to do that just because they want to have that piece of paper in their hand that they can tape to those loaner trays. When they're, going in a case card, they can tape that piece of paper, even though, if they're using SenseTrack, our labels, clearly state all the information, when the case is, where the case is, who the surgeon is. I mean, all of that is right on the label. However, they still want that, piece of paper that they can tape to that. And I don't know if it's just because, well, we've done it forever this way and this is how we want to do it. But there are a lot of places along the way where problems can arise, and whether that's the surgery scheduler doesn't get that information to the rep in a timely fashion, the rep doesn't bring in the trays in a timely fashion, SPD maybe doesn't have adequate staff, as the staffing levels are critical in almost all hospitals at this point, maybe they don't have adequate staff to get these trays turned over in a timely fashion. I guess there's so many different things that can go wrong during that process that I think a lot of places want to keep all that documentation kind of as a CYA for anything related to loaners.
Like, having been a department manager myself, I love kind of asking questions of other department managers that I already know the answer to. And I'm not going to pose this question to you, but I'm just going to bring it up because you touched on it. That paper tracking process, especially through the decontamination area, there's a lot of kind of commonsensical compromises that folks make in transitioning paper like through the dirty area on a tray. It's getting separated somehow, but then it's going over to the clean side, but it's paper. It's not being disinfected. Now, I have seen and heard of some solutions around that, like, putting in a plastic sleeve or doing whatever, but y'all, we have to get a better way than that process for the papers connected to loaners in particular. And also, you see the same with clinic instrument tracking, which is a whole nother conversation, but that's also often heavily dependent on paper. And yet we just kind of compromise, I think, in some of our cross-contamination philosophies when it comes to that. So I just want to bring that up. Great outline, though, about the potential data holes and breakdowns. And I'm just going to kind of jump in a little bit more here because there's so many data points around that life cycle of a loaner. Like, I kind of want to start maybe at the beginning. And you mentioned typically in these categories, it's going to have a rep involved, even if it's the consignment, tray they're refilling or they're restocking or they're at least doing like an annual inventory of the consignment trays. But then a lot of times, especially nowadays, we're seeing couriers as the ones that are bringing the trays in. And I love, standing there at the drop off and they've got 8 trays and they're like, yeah, it's for Dr. Johnson tomorrow. And we're like, okay, yeah, which case? And they're like, I don't know. They told me Dr. Johnson and it's tomorrow. And we're like, dude, you got to give me something else. So let's start right there. The check-in process. If it's courier, if it's sales rep, like what kind of data points should we be gathering and expecting? It's reasonable, I guess, at that check-in.
At the check-in process, I think at a bare minimum, they need to be able to provide the case, the time of the case, the physician, and names of all the trays. Because, sometimes, they're dropping off striker trays and maybe they call them one thing, but really there's something else, or the container says one thing, the lid says something else, and the rep calls it something entirely different, and the doctor calls it something different too. So I guess, they need to, be able to provide the specifics related to the set, the specifics related to the physician, and the date and time of the procedure at a bare minimum. And however that information gets transmitted, we have a couple different in Censis Track, a couple different means of getting that information, where either the staff enter that information, or we have Loaner Link, which is like a more advanced loaner tracking process, where it's the onus is back on the rep. The rep is the one that creates the cases, enters all that information, and then just transmits it to SPD. So it's not so much with the decon staff who have all the gloves and the face shield and everything trying to do all this stuff, and work with a courier who doesn't have any idea what the stuff is. They're just dropping it off. So that's the first thing, that when the items arrive, that's the bare minimum of stuff that really needs to be, adequately conveyed to the staff on site.
My next question is what they call softball. And it's, what is your opinion on taking photos of these trays during that intake drop-off process to verify and just have some documentation trail? Are you a fan of photos at that stage?
Yes, I think it's critical, because I worked in SPDs where we didn't take pictures of those incoming trays. And the first problem it causes is, stuff goes through the wash, and maybe you have separate levels of a tray. It gets to the other side, and now staff don't know how to put the trays back together. And so they end up putting the wrong level of one tray into another tray because they don't have any point of reference to look at. The rep didn't leave a count sheet for the tray, whatever. So that's the first thing, that those pictures kind of alleviate that problem. And then also those trays get dropped off. They go through the whole circle. They get used. The rep picks them up. A week later, calls back and says, hey, I just got such and such a tray, and my $5,000 whatchamajiggy is missing, and you last had it, so you threw it in the garbage, so you can now buy me my new whatchamajiggy. And then, if you don't have any sort of way to say, no, we didn't throw it in the garbage, well, at that point, if we're the last ones that had possession of those trays, pretty much you're going to buy that new thing for that rep. Whereas if you have pictures of those coming in, you could be like, well, no, when we got this tray, that item was already missing. So, you can go back to the previous people that had it before us, and maybe they'll buy it for you, but we're not going to.
And that's not a hypothetical. I think we've got a lot of folks listening to this podcast who are like shaking their heads like, oh yeah, if you only knew how much money we were spending every year on quote unquote lost items. But to your point, they may not have been truly lost. It's just you can't prove one way or the other that they were there at the drop-off. So yeah, that's why I say softball, is because I think everybody in the loaner world now is starting to realize the value of that photographic evidence. That's a fantastic point.
If you have a webcam, set up in your decon area or your loaner check-in area or whatever, it literally is one click of, click, put the new tray there, click, put a new tray there, click. So, it's more cumbersome if you have to use your cell phone, or you have to use a regular camera and then download your computer and then go find those and attach them, whatever. That is more, troublesome. But, if you're using a webcam, it's so simple and easy. In one lost instrument, you're going to have that return on investment of the cost of that webcam, easily by getting out of having to pay for one instrument. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you can use the webcam to do interviews with Beyond Clean later, so it's like multi-use.
Yes, exactly.
But so, moving on in the workflow, and I kind of want to combine decontam with the assembly and sterilization stage. I know that's a lot to combine, but a lot of those data points, I think, cross over. Like what you need in decon, you also need in the assembly and sterilization kind of phase in terms of data points, and for many of the same reasons. So what are some of those key things in processing loaners, the data points that are important in those kind of future stages of the reprocessing workflow?
Well, and you mentioned before about the, cross-contamination and sending, that paper that everybody loves, sending that paper. It comes into decon, you got your dirty gloves on, you're handling that paper, and then you pass it out to the clean side. In theory, if you're using a tracking system, you can print those labels. If there's a label printer in decon, you can print those labels to scan those into the washer, keep track of those trays going through that decon process, the decontamination and the disinfecting in the washer. And then the people on the clean side can print their own labels on the other side. So you don't need to be passing, paperwork from the dirty side to the clean side. So you can avoid that whole, thing. Once it gets to the clean side, they can print off clean labels. And then when they wrap their sets, affix those clean labels. And then on that clean side, go from the assembly, putting those trays together, and if they need to reference back to the pictures or anything, they can do that. And then wrapping the sets, sterilizing them. And then those same labels is, what they're going to use to scan those sets to keep track of, when they were put in the sterilizer, when they're done. If it's a rush, a lot of times, reps will bring them in and be like, oh, the case is in 2 hours. Are they going to be ready? And so you can, you'll know exactly, okay, well, we put them in the sterilizer 45 minutes ago. So they'll be done and they're going to be hot in 15 minutes. But if you absolutely have to take them, whatever, you can kind of go from there. So, and then from there, you'll know, when they're ready to go, and then where the next location is that they're going to go to.
Kind of built in maybe to this barcode conversation or to those labels is a very important point here. And you might have said it earlier and I missed it, but it's the point about IFUs. And if you're doing a manual process, obviously you need to have captured those IFUs both for the decontamination phase, because there's different soak times, there's ultrasonic cleaning times, on into the assembly stage on can these trays be wrapped? If they are wrapped or containerized, what cycles are they validated or run on in these autoclaves? And all that kind of information can be built in through those labels and barcodes if it's a loaner that's built into your system. Otherwise, it can become really complex really quick to constantly be differentiating manually between these different trays and different vendors that are coming through the process all throughout the shifts to ensure that you're compliantly processing these trays, not just cleanly and quickly. Do you have any comments about that?
Like part of Censis, you can put in like decontam instructions specific to whatever the loaners are. So if there's, like the Smith and Nephew stuff in particular, it's a lot of taking apart things that it's like 4 steps to take apart an instrument to thoroughly be able to clean it. So you can put those, decontam instructions right, specific to that set. Or maybe like you said, the sterilization, it can only be sterilized at 275, 10, and 40 or something. So you can put that specific sterilization cycle and you can print that right on the label. So then okay, this can't be run on a 270 420. It needs to be run on that longer because it's got implants, it's got, whatever the issue might be that it requires that longer sterilization time. But all of that stuff is, very important to those processing of those trays.
We talked earlier, or at least I alluded to the fact that tracking loaners and consigned instruments and sets can be really important to supply chain as well, because it seems like bills show up all the time for instruments that are missing. And then the department's like, wait a second, we didn't lose that. The vendor lost that. It was never even here to begin with. You can see we never used it in a procedure. I feel like you get into a lot of he said, she said conflict, except that it's kind of removing the actual end user, because the conflict usually winds up being between SPD and the vendor and supply chain, and the operating room kind of gets left out of that, but they're the ones that are really utilizing the sets. And I'm not pointing fingers at who's to blame. I'm just saying, like, man, there is a lot of gray area in there when you're not collecting this information, and especially when it comes to money. And you just talked about the cost of travelers, and money is really critical for hospitals these days. So it can only get uglier. But I think that's one that maybe management is aware of, but maybe not always frontline staff are aware that not having a tracking system leaves a lot in that administrative area to really create a lot of conflict. But what are some other negative impacts of not tracking these loaners or consignments to the level that you just kind of walked through with Hank and talked about pictures and data points around?
Yeah. And, like the financial aspect of it, like you were talking, there's several different places along the way that, something can go missing. It may be as soon as those trays come in, maybe something legitimately, it ends up in a wrong container, or somebody doesn't know where it goes and they peel pack it and stuff it on an ortho shelf in a peel pack. It very well could be SPD's fault that it's missing, or it could go to the OR, it ends up in the garbage or whatever. Or I've experienced when working as a traveler that, the loaners get checked out. They go to this loaner waiting area to be picked up. And another rep is like, oh, I'm missing that. So I'm just going to help myself to that. And then it disappears, after it's made its way all the way around. But now it walks off with a different rep who happened to be missing the $5,000 whatever. And so he just, helped himself to it. So, there's many different places. And like you said, though, it usually goes back to SPD, like, okay, well, you guys, are like the scapegoat for this whole situation. So it does that, the financial aspects of having a tracking system is one of the greatest or a very, very good thing. But probably the most important thing, and, the most important part of SPD as a whole is patient care. And having those tracking systems and being able to, if a case is delayed because loaners aren't processed in a timely fashion, that has a poor, effect back on that patient. If there's some sort of issue after the fact, if there's a surgical site infection or something like that, you can go back and track back specifically to, okay, it wasn't just a Synthes loaner tray. It was the Synthes small frag, and it was this specific Synthes small frag that was brought in by such and such on such day, and they can track back specifically to, what instrumentation was used. You can check, what, if you've scanned it throughout the loop, you can check, what washer it was washed in and that the parameters of the washer were met. You can check that it was scanned into the sterilizer, that the sterilizer parameters were met. So all the points along the way, you can verify that, okay, all of these things were met. And so it shouldn't be a issue of the tray wasn't processed properly. So if you're just bringing trays in and sending them on their way, you don't have any of that back information.
Yeah, I feel like in a lot of cases, people look at documentation as simply a CYA mechanism that empowers them to defend the staff, right? But when it comes to leadership, I think this data can be helpful in other ways too, which is simply enforcing policies. And I think you kind of got to that, like, what kind of lead time do we have? What's our policy around how long before these trays come in do we get the IFU? And then looking at documentation around when they don't. And, is there any trends or patterns there? What other kinds of data can managers get from tracking these, vendor managed inventory sets and really use it to improve the department or the awareness when they go to leadership?
Yeah, and like specific things that we have available in CensiTrack, we have, like you said, the lead time report. We have a report that'll tell you, what the lead time is. If your vendor policy says it's 48 hours before the procedure, you can run that lead time report and see, oh, we got this 2 hours before the procedure. And you can look at it for a month and be like, oh, well, Smith and Nephew consistently brings their trays in 2 hours before the procedure. So you can then address, you can start holding those reps accountable for, you need to ensure that these trays are coming in a timely fashion so we can ensure that they're done in a timely fashion for those cases. There's also, location reports that can be run so you know exactly where those trays are at any given minute. If you need to know, okay, they've been scanned to the loaner holding area or whatever, you can have reports for what trays are awaiting pickup. Sometimes some facilities I've been at, they end up with like shelves and shelves and shelves full of loaners waiting to be picked up that never get picked up because the reps are like, well, I'll just leave them here until I need them somewhere else and I don't want to drive around in my car with them or whatever. So, you can ensure that they're getting picked up in a timely fashion to avoid having other people rummaging through their trays, things being lost, things like that. The sterilizer load compliance is another positive aspect of using those tracking systems. You can, put those weights directly on those loaner trays so you can ensure that they're compliant with your policy or against the AAMI standards, that, they're under 25 pounds. And then also that, the CensiTrack will tally that up. If you have a load of heavy loaners, if you overload your sterilizer, CensiTrack will be like, nope, you can't put all these on one load. And then you can, back that up and divide it or do whatever you need to do. So all of those are, different things that are available, to correct problems in that loaner process.
Yeah, I think just having a lot of that information around policy is important for the staff. Like you mentioned, last thing you need as a manager is staff being out for ergonomic issues or back pain. And it's the reason that standard was written, and AORN had one as well. And all for those same reasons. It's so that we keep our workforce up and running. And, that ties right back to the traveler. It seems like everything ties back to the traveler conversation these days. But honestly, you can't afford to be down staff. You just can't right now. And
if you're putting in, those trays, if you've got, 20 trays that are all 25 pounds a piece, that's too much metal mass. Those, your sterilizer is going to fail, your biological is going to fail. And then, maybe you're under the gun to get these, loaners run anyways. And then you find out, you finally get them done and you're ready to turn them loose and your biological fails. Well, now you have to start all over at the beginning again and go through the whole process. So that's, again, going back to the patient safety, you have to ensure that the stuff is done, properly. Your biologicals pass, that, you're not having to reprocess stuff and things like that.
All right, Jill, great job. This is an area of huge opportunity for departments all across the country. There's no doubt in my mind. And it's something that's been discussed, but sometimes getting the budget approved and everything else. And again, when finances are tight, it gets really difficult, but there's an ROI here that I think can be, made significantly for moving into this space and getting a handle on this vendor managed inventory. So thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was Jill Sweeney, clinical educator at Censis, and Hank talking about vendor managed inventory. We've had some podcasts on this topic in the past, but really not quite from this conversation, definitely not in the context of an entire season on tracking systems. But I think really the pictures has been a theme already. We've talked about pictures in prior episodes this season, but not in the context of the application that you might have for vendor managed inventory. But when we were talking about disassembling certain instruments and seeing those pictures of the instrument disassembled and assembled, I mean, that's one of the biggest things with technology is the information, and the visual representation of that information can be extremely helpful. And where it applies most importantly is really around the budget. And as Jill described, if you don't secure the room for that vendor managed inventory, there can be a lot of hands and a lot of sets. And ultimately, a lot of times, as she mentioned, SPD ends up being the scapegoat for why those dollars are going out the door and being billed back to the hospital.
Yeah, Justin, if you're a nerd on this topic, I would recommend that you check out the vendor management expert that we have, the expert series for Beyond Clean. His name is Jeff Wirtz, and every month he's talking about a different topic in this category. So you can check him out on social media. And then we release those episodes later through the Beyond Clean podcast feed. So you can listen to all kinds of conversations around this vendor management conversation. So you're right. We've covered it, here and there on the show before, but this is a good basic introduction to the opportunity and the challenges of this conversation. As I alluded to, there's a lot more where the conversation comes from in integrating IFUs and talking about those photographs, as you mentioned. I think there's even more we can do on calculating that ROI in terms of storage space and the processing costs, etc. So I'm really happy with how this conversation went, but I'm also excited that I think we're going to have a few more of these where this one came from.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this show. But as a reminder, we'd love it if you'd support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on either Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. Find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or Spotify. And we're also going to be available on your favorite podcast application. You just got to search for Beyond Clean Podcast. Finally, the best way to get our episodes is to download our smartphone app. And while you're there downloading, we'd appreciate a rating and a review for the app because your feedback's important to the show. If you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email on over to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank and myself, thanks for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.